Emmerdale that hasn't aired on ITV1 yet, but can be viewed on ITVX. Celia Daniels, J. Griffiths, was planning a big move in Friday, December 19th. Emmerdale. Criminals generally prefer an easy time, and things are getting a bit too lively around the village for Celia's liking. So she's moving on. Business partner Moira Dingle, Natalie J. Robb, had previously walloped Celia in the face in the Woolpack after discovering a pile of dodgy invoices relating to their partnership. In this episode, she and Kane Jeff Hordley headed to Celia's farm to confront her, and Moira said she wanted to be out of their partnership. Celia's discovery that Ted, one of the laborers who works on Celia, had her jaw set like a door that had been slammed and bolted. "You want out of the partnership?" she'd asked, as if the question were an inventory check. When Moira's reply was sharp, Celia asked for time. She said she had plans. Ray Walters watched this from the barn doorway, leaning on the frame as if the wood could hold him upright. Watching his mother be accused of something that might finally strip the velvet from her velvet-gloved hands made him itch with a fury he could not reconcile. Loyalty to the woman who'd raised him, and a growing tenderness for the idea of something else entirely. A life with Laurel Thomas, simple and honest, and impossibly real in a way his world was not. The truth that made Celia's operation dangerous and certain to end was a secret threaded through the farm like an old telephone line. Ted, a laborer who bent and hauled and hummed as if the land soothed his soul, was not Ted at all. He was Bear Wolf Joshua Richards, a man with family living not far from that same village, a quiet man with a history that did not fit the fleece of the fields he tilled. Celia had known where Bear had come from and how to bend him. She knew what he would do if reminded of promises. That knowledge had made her operation easier until Bear's face started to ache with recognition of his own name. And then there was Marlon Dingle, who sat up late at night paying for silence like it was an insurance policy you kept because you loved somebody else more than yourself. £2,000 a week for keeping his daughter April out of dealing. A bludgeon of money meant to stop doors being kicked in and to keep his family from being stolen into commerce they hadn't consented to. Ray's men, the ones who ran errands and ran messages and learned to make threats like small talk, supplied the friction that kept Marlon's fear warm. Dylan Penders limped across that map of threats like a landmine nobody had yet combed. He shrieked innocence about the night a van had fishtailed into his leg, about how Ray had run him down to teach April a lesson. But innocence in Emmerdale was often somewhere between a legal defense and a costume. Dylan had reason to keep his mouth shut. Ray had reason to ensure it stayed shut. The problem with things like this, with the microscopic balancing of leverage and favor and terror, was that anyone could slip and set fire to the whole. Ray's love for Laurel had grown like a secret spring, sudden, thirsty, and unstoppable once discovered. Laurel had smiled at him the way someone does at a dog who has become unexpectedly gentle. It released something in him that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with wanting to be better. He'd started imagining a future where his hands were clean and his shirt smelled of breakfast, not petrol. It was dangerous dreaming for a man whose life had been built on other people's weaknesses. Celia was a strategist. She mapped the village's weak points like one traces a river's floodplain. When the Woolpack row cooled, she called Ray into her office at the farm and closed the door behind them. A plan that smelled of moving boxes and new beginnings came to light, but it was the sort of plan that had teeth. "We're moving on," she said. "New farm. Wrexham. January 1st. We take the books, the workers, and whatever makes us money." She spoke like someone announcing the weather. Ray's mouth went dry. "Wrexham?" He tried to make his voice light, to throw down a question without the tremble of pleading. "You can't just Laurel is here. You know why I came back." "You'll be with us," Celia said. "You think I'm blind to what you want, son. I'm not a fool. But we will be moving the whole operation. It's safer, it's cleaner. And we're taking April." The room shrank. Ray thought of Laurel stirring a mug in the kitchen of number 3, of the way she sometimes hummed when she was thinking. He thought of the impossible gentleness he'd felt when she'd touched his arm. The idea of cutting that thread felt like cutting his own throat. "You can't take her," he said, but his voice sounded thin. Celia smiled in the way that suggested she'd considered his voice and decided it irrelevant. "We take her and the payday continues. Marlon will keep paying because he'll keep believing it's the safest option. Play your part, son. Stay with me if you want, or if your romantic fantasy matters to you more, walk away. But do not hamper the plan." Ray's attempt to bargain, that Marlon was already paying for a kind of peace, that they'd lose the cash if they moved, dwindled against her arithmetic. Celia had done sums in her head like others prayed. She saw the future as a flow chart, each person a node that could be shifted along a line. Meanwhile, Marlon sat cross-legged on his sofa, the light from the TV painting his face a soft blue. He kept telling himself the money was for April's safety. He'd told that story to himself so many times it had become liturgical. Marlon and his wife had made a pact. Whatever it took to keep the girl away from the streets and from Ray's kind of men, they would pay. It had been humiliating and sanctifying in equal measure. Now the shame had edged into anger. If Celia was moving April away, how could he keep her safe? How did you keep someone's child safe when the people forcing safety were the ones who made danger their business? There were small rebellions in the village, hushed ones. Angie and Bob got involved one evening, offering to help with calls to the police. Another day Dan came by offering to kidnap notes of his own to carry into the field. But the problem with calling the cops was that Celia's operation had feathers that slid right into places that sonar couldn't pick up. They paid people in envelopes, threatened things they didn't put on paper. The Dingles had called the police before. It hadn't solved the problem. That knowledge hardened them. Dylan's silence felt like a bomb on a timer. He'd said he didn't know anything, which could mean a dozen different things. Ignorance, delusion, calculation. People like Dylan made choices that could snap their own necks or someone else's. Ray watched him from across the village once, saw the way Dylan rubbed his leg like it hurt him more than the hospital had fixed. Ray's mind skittered. What if Dylan cracked? What if he told someone who might use that knowledge as leverage? The fold of consequences grew. Bear Wolf, Ted, when he donned that low cap and mended fences, had started to look like a man who remembered being Bear and remembered more than was convenient. Ray had watched Bear stand at the edge of a field and stare too long at the boundary where two towns met, like a dog remembering a park. Bear had a child somewhere, someone who had paid for his silence with hope and prayer. Celia knew where the linchpins were and planned to take them with her. In the week before New Year's Eve, the village breathed with the kind of tension that made ornaments fragile. Celia's men prepared crates and covered the bigger machinery with tarps that looked like they were trying to eat the farm. Ray walked the perimeter at dusk and could hear the distant laughter from Laurel's kitchen, the clink of cutlery, the ordinary sounds that belonged to the life he wanted. He felt sleepless and raw. On the day the trucks were due to move, a brittle frost made everything silver. Celia moved through harvest-hardened men with the certainty of a general. She had the phone numbers of hosts in Wrexham prearranged, and the route mapped where the roads were flatter and the checkpoints few. Ray sat in the driver's seat of the lead van with his hands flat against the wheel. He had not told Laurel. He told himself he couldn't burden her with the truth until after it was done, or until he had chosen the life he would take. Laurel woke that morning with a feeling she couldn't name. Love makes people alert to small discrepancies. She was making breakfast when Ray knocked at the door with an awkwardness that let her know his insides had been rearranged. Her face lit. He leaned in and almost kissed her, but the moment froze between them, held by gravity no one could see. "We're moving," he said finally, and she saw him for what he was, a man wrenched between two lives. "Moving," she echoed. A laugh came that bordered on hysteria. "Where? You're not with them, are you?" Ray hesitated, then told her, and her face folded into something like grief. Laurel had never asked Ray to leave his past, she'd asked only for honesty. To see the web he'd been spun into, she was grasped by the possibility that she might lose him to it forever. "I can go with you," she said. "We can leave. We can." Ray's heart somersaulted. The world for a moment balanced on the tiny hinge of a plan that would still be a plan if he had the courage. Then Celia's voice slid into his ear like an old song he couldn't get out of his head. "You think of everything." She'd told him she could take April, and in return they'd keep the money. She'd framed the problem with a solution that traded a child for cash. In Ray's smaller, softer world, the ledger looked monstrous. Meanwhile, Marlon's decision had been made with the clumsy heroism of a man who had loved his child more than his fear. He decided to follow. He borrowed a van and positioned himself behind the convoy at a safe distance, his hands white-knuckled on a steering wheel he'd once used to deliver logs. His wife sat beside him, dry-eyed, a fierce, quiet resolve in her features. They had tried to call the police again, and been given the same soft skepticism. In Emmerdale, the badge was sometimes a piece of brass that could not weigh down the truth. Dylan, for reasons that were his own, guilt, revenge, the need to be seen, decided to act as well. He'd told friends he was going to confront Ray about the night the van had hit him, to demand truth or restitution. But he went to the wrong place at the wrong time. He went to the edge of the convoy where the road narrowed into a ribbon that curled like a held breath. The cork of the village event popped on a road with hedges close enough to whisper. The convoy rolled, the engines humming. Ray's van led, Celia's followed. The world had reduced to the sound of tires and the smell of diesel. Laurel, who had insisted on coming along to stop the nonsense before it began, strode toward the lead van with Marlon shouting behind her. The van of the Dingles a distant stain in the rear view. She had to speak to Celia, to demand that no child be moved like cargo. When Laurel stepped into the road, Celia's driver slowed, and Ray leaned out the window to call to her. It was then that Dylan's van materialized from the hedgerow like an idea that had been lurking. He was angry, his eyes were thin. He thought he could scare them, maybe even stop the operation by making a scene. He did not plan the angle his wheel would take on the gravel, the way a landscape can be honest in its cruelties. The first sound was a shout, high and raw. Laurel moved because she was Laurel. To protect a child she thought she could help, to reason with a mother she didn't understand. Ray lunged forward, Laurel. The world pulled taut like a wire. Then metal screamed. Dylan's van clipped a wheel. For a second the world slowed down. Ray's hand on Laurel's arm, Marlon's face a map of horror, Celia's eyes like chips of flint. The lead van rocked, then swung. Time unstitched. A crate fell off the back of the next truck, thudding like a cadenced heart. The smell of coolant and fear filled the air. Ray pushed Laurel back, his legs losing ground as the lead van shuddered and the steering corrected. Too late. The sound of impact was a terrible, blunt punctuation. A scream threaded through it, a raw sound that belonged to someone who had been punched into the future. The Dingles van swerved and found the ditch. Dylan's face was white as the frost. Silence landed like a snowdrift. People's faces were stripped to bone. Someone called out. Sirens began to wail in the distance. But sirens do not arrive fast enough when a life hangs by a thread you can't see. Laurel lay on the tarmac, her breath a broken bell. Ray knelt beside her, hands slick with something that might have been oil or something darker. His voice was a strangled thing. Laurel, speak to me. It was the kind of cry that breaks the dam between what a man has been and what he must become. Celia watched from the truck, her face unreadable. Her plan had been arithmetic and movement, but life was a variable that laughed at equations. She had wanted to keep leverage, to move and to continue. Instead she saw one of her own. Not her lover, not her family, but someone attached to her scheme. Perhaps the very child she intended to take. Now at risk because someone else's pain had turned into a machine. Marlon staggered forward, knees buckling. He had followed to the edge of reason, and now stood at the precipice where consequences took shape. He saw his daughter, limp, or maybe only stunned, and the money that had felt like insurance was suddenly as thin as tissue paper. Ray's eyes met Celia's for a flash. An accusation, a plea, the full weight of what they'd done pressed into that second. Celia's lips were a flat line. "Get the ambulance," she said, voice clipped and efficient. The orders came like frost, cold and useful. But what was useful in the seconds when a life might slip between breath and reason? Laurel's chest rose in shallow, panicked rasp. Ray's fingers fumbled for a pulse he knew he should not be feeling yet trembled to feel. The world had narrowed to the size of a heart under pressure. Dylan sat on the verge, his hands cradling his head. He had not intended this. His anger had been a small, manageable thing he thought he could contain. He had not thought of Laurel's laugh, of Ray's softening, of the consequences of driving a van like a human cannon. The guilt curdled in him. As the ambulance lights painted the hedgerows, Ray made a choice that no lawbook could have predicted. He stayed by Laurel's side, speaking to her in a voice softened by something new and savage. "Don't go," he whispered. "Please don't go. I'm here. I'll fix this. I'll change." Celia watched him and calculated again. In her head the move to Wrexham was not merely relocation but protection, a way to keep business and leverage safe. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Emmerdale Echoes.